Welcome to ACSA's Take Off podcast, where we explore trends, challenges, innovations that are shaping aviation as we know it in Africa and beyond. Now, with a growing continental footprint, ambitious cargo expansion plans, Airports Company South Africa is positioning itself at the heart of Africa's evolving trade and logistics landscape. Now, in today's episode, we're joined by Mpho Rambau, who's the Group Manager for Traffic Development at ACSA. Mpho brings deep insights into exactly how ACSA hopes to respond to shifting global trade dynamics, the investment in infrastructure that is on the horizon for the company, and how we all hope that unlocks the potential of intra-African air cargo, especially within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So with that, Mpho, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So the first question, I think we need to start with the inaugural ICAO Global Air Cargo Summit that was held in April in Turkey.
Yes.
ACSA sent a delegation there to represent the company. I know that there were obviously on our end key takeaways, but what were some of the key messages that as an organization we wanted to convey at the summit?
Thank you so much for that. Indeed, we did participate in the inaugural ICAO Air Cargo Summit, which came just as the right time, where we have seen a disruption in global trade owing to a lot of protectionism, primarily amongst Western countries. And I think the goal for ACSA participating in this platform was to really show how we were opening up for business and how we are geared for expansion. We are looking to evolve from our current air cargo operating model to a different one, and that would require us to have specific skills. And us participating in the event allows us to really communicate what our growth strategies are, and ideally look for partners that we can work with in order to grow and achieve our strategic objectives.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your response, you touched on, global dynamics, geopolitics. There was some geopolitical movement, coincidentally, around about the same time as the summit. We know that the U.S. administration announced a new tariff regime that created a lot of uncertainty, certainly around AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunities Act.
Yeah.
So talk to us about that and, with all of that noise happening, how is ACSA's growth strategy as it relates to air cargo impacted by all of that noise, if it is at all? And just talk to us about that, the thinking and the strategy around that.
Yeah. So we have identified that there is a need to refocus our cargo strategy, which will be underpinned by the development and strengthening of our current existing supply chains, as well as looking for new growth opportunities, primarily within the African continent, where we see a lot of growth in the next decade or two, and legislative dispensations such as SATAM that would unlock new growth opportunities for Airports Company South Africa. We're also looking at new markets to enhance our trade with partners such as China and India that are part of BRICS and also are showing signs of significant growth in a global scale. And ideally, our goal is to ensure that we are able to align ourselves with these markets by developing new connectivity, which will then further enhance our trade and investment between these countries or these markets.
All right, fantastic. So we already have existing legislation. We've got legislation that is likely to be developed that will facilitate all of this growth. But when we think about logistics, you need infrastructure for that.
Yes.
So let's talk about how ACSA hopes to invest in infrastructure so as to be able to, have the capacity for the demand that you're talking about.
Yes. So ACSA is going to go on a massive drive in terms of investment in new infrastructure. And Tambo International being our key flagship hub for air cargo, which accounts for over 80% of our total air cargo traffic, essentially will be the first one that will get a benefit of a brand new terminal. The project is referred to as mid-fill cargo, which will essentially increase our handling capacity from about 450,000 tons per annum to about 2.2 million tons.
Wow.
By 2033. This is a significant investment that we are making, but it's in line with the opportunities that we've seen in the air cargo space, which potentially we need to position ourselves and realign ourselves to ensure that we do have the adequate capacity to grow. We are also going to be focusing on air cargo across the board, with some investments being made across the entire network to ensure that we have state-of-the-art facilities and that are targeted at specific commodities within the various regions where our airports are located, to really ensure that we are geared up to really stimulate the growth and achieve our strategic objectives in the air cargo area.
I'm struck by the use of the word, stimulating growth. And, you can't help but think about the South African context, our microeconomic context. We have very slow economic recovery. This was already fact prior to the pandemic. That was only exacerbated by the pandemic. And even on the other side of that, we're still struggling. How do you think this growth strategy, particularly as it pertains to air cargo, kind of ties into assisting to stimulate economic growth in the country?
Yeah. So growing air cargo, which would be underpinned by us growing our network connectivity, our route network, to ensure that we have adequate connectivity to global markets, will essentially open up South African exports or potential exports to new markets. And therefore, South African manufacturers, producers, farmers will have greater options to export their commodities into the global market. And essentially what this will do is it will support the economic growth and development of this country by ensuring that we are able to increase our productivity and output, primarily targeted at exporting our products into new markets or the global markets. And essentially, that's how we see this playing a significant role. And that's why infrastructure development is quite key to this, because there are certain markets where you require certain infrastructure in order to be able to access those markets. And so our imperative is to ensure that we invest or make the right investments in infrastructure to support the local manufacturers and farmers, and to give them adequate access to the global markets, which is essentially going to improve our trade.
Okay, fantastic. So South Africans are not going to get left behind, even as ACSA, right? So we've discussed, some of the geopolitical movements that perhaps acted as a catalyst for these conversations, the legislation that's already in place. We've discussed infrastructure development so that we are ready to handle the demand. We're capacitated to handle the demand. Yeah. But let's talk about the realities, right? Air connectivity matters in the transportation of cargo across the continent. In its current state, would you say we're okay? Or in our current state, Africa's air connectivity still acts as an impediment of sorts?
So I would say there has been quite great improvement in the last 2 decades as it relates to intra-Africa connectivity. And what that has led to is the emergence of other hubs within the African continent. And we have seen, in East Africa, Ethiopia and Kenya emerging as significant cargo hubs within the African continent. We potentially also have North Africa in the likes of Morocco as well as Egypt that are also significant hubs within the African continent, and some other emerging hubs in Central Africa, in countries such as Rwanda, that has really provided a significant improvement in terms of air connectivity. So I would say we have seen quite a significant improvement in the past 2 decades. However, we still have areas where there really is poor connectivity. And that's where I think legislation such as SATAM play a critical role in ensuring that there is an agent that is meant to fast track and stimulate air connectivity within the African continent. And there has been a lot of buy-in from a lot of the other African states, which is quite a positive development. And I think underpinned by SATAM, we are really poised for renewed growth and investment in terms of connectivity, which is quite crucial. And I think as legislations like this improve the liberal state of bilateral air service agreements, this will allow for a lot of airlines to start investing in the African continent, which I think will be crucial, particularly for other airport operators in other areas within Africa, to start also improving their infrastructure. So I do think that our current state is one that shows significant improvement in the last 2 decades, and we're actually poised and positioned for growth, with respect to the African continent, underpinned by the likes of SATAM as well as the Free Continental Trade Area.
Is there appetite? I know it's a very simplistic way to put it, and perhaps even too a little reductive, but is there appetite? It's one thing to be watching geopolitical movements and to see if perhaps this is the time to act. But we've seen, with the growth of the BRICS regional bloc as well, there are a lot of pointers that would signify appetite. But again, is that a reality? Is there appetite to see this amount of kind of continental growth?
Yeah, I think there is appetite, and you just have to look at the effort that has been spent in crafting this legislative imperatives and crafting strategies to improve trade within the African continent. And I think this comes with a massive realization that as Africa, we've always been dependent on primarily the Western countries to export our raw materials and essentially buy back finished goods, but hardly trading in and amongst each other, where a barrister in South Africa would be buying coffee beans of Ugandan origin somewhere in the UK. And essentially, the appetite is there to reduce the trade barriers that prevent us from really effectively trading with each other. And that will stimulate demand for goods to actually move within the African continent, which will influence greater investments from the airlines once the demand is there. And once the airlines start investing and developing all these routes and connectivity within the African continent, there's going to be a spur of infrastructure developments from the airport operators to ensure that they are able to adequately receive and process this cargo. So I think those are primarily the 2 phases of how we foresee the future evolving within the African continent. The appetite is there, and I think there are certain sectors within the air transport industry that are really dependent on others. So as soon as legislation allows for demand to grow, we will see investment from the airlines. And once the investments from the airline starts flowing in, we will then see airport operators investing also in infrastructure to ensure that they are well poised to harness the growth.
Okay. I think I was a little cheeky with that question about appetite, because last year, as you know, we held the ACI Africa Regional Conference. We had the opportunity as ACSA to host, and the theme for that conference was partnerships and alliances. So there very much is appetite. And I think what's important is the key conversations have already begun. Necessary steps have been taken. The key role players are in the room and they're having those discussions. Are there any other players perhaps that we are not aware of that still need to come to the party with regards to this?
So if you look at the parties that are around the table, and primarily I draw to the markets that have already signed up and adopted, in principle, SATAM and the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, represents a significant majority of the entire African continent. So with what we have now, really we have the buy-in and support most of the significant regions and countries to really see something impactful.
All right, well, in closing, Mpho, because we've touched on pretty much everything at this point, I think looking ahead, what role do you see ACSA playing when we look at Africa's evolving trade landscape?
So South Africa is one of the biggest markets within the African continent. We have very good infrastructure and a diversified manufacturing base. And how we play a role in Africa's evolving trade is with us increasing our high-end finished goods and exporting those into the African continent. And essentially this capacity to produce and export will drive a lot of investment from the airlines into the South African market and potentially access strategically located assets and airports will be well poised and positioned to harness a lot of this growth. So how I see ACSA and South Africa in large playing a role in the evolving trade within the African continent is really us driving significant investment into diversifying further our manufacturing base. Already we have quite a strong agri-processing industry. We have a strong automotive industry, and we actually lead the continent in terms of aerospace development. And these are all key sectors that are really conducive for air cargo within the African continent. So I do anticipate for our airports, which are strategically located, to really play a big role in facilitating trade between South Africa and the African continent, as well as influencing a lot of the investments that we are going to see within Africa and South Africa in particular.
All right. Well, that does bring us to the end of this conversation. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your insights with us. And I hope that for audiences who are watching this episode, you have at least been, given a glimpse of what we mean when we talk about ACSA's cargo leadership, specifically in the African context, and everything that the company is trying to achieve through its air cargo growth strategy by acting as an impetus of sorts for that diversification that we were talking about and leading the charge in that sense. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we hope to see you in the next installment.